In March, Western Sydney experienced its worst flood in 3 decades. Sky News meteorologists are forecasting the next major flood within 4 years. Rob Sharpe, one of our meteorologists, joins us live with this exclusive story. So, Rob, what are you basing the forecast on?
So essentially the forecast is mostly based on history and what has taken place across the Hawkesbury-Nepean catchment area over the last couple of hundred years, but it's also looking at some of the climate drivers and a little known climate driver, the interdecadal Pacific Oscillation. And so that's something that I talk about in the piece, and it's essentially in the Pacific Ocean. It's not like El Nino and La Nina, where they last for just 1 or 2 years at a time. The interdecadal Pacific Oscillation lasts for 20, 30, 40, 50 years at a time. And that's why we can have these long stretches with wetter conditions in Eastern Australia and long stretches with drier conditions over a fairly extended period.
Yeah, it's very interesting and a bit of a tongue twister for this time of morning to get out. Well done. So let's have a look at your package now and let's learn more about it.
Western Sydney is still recovering from its most severe flood in more than 3 decades, but don't count on another 30 years wait before the next major flood. At Sky News Weather, we're forecasting it's likely to occur within the next 4 years, and there's every chance it will be even higher and more destructive than the recent March event. In early 2021, New South Wales experienced its 3rd wettest week on record with a statewide average of 102 millimetres. The worst affected areas were on the mid-north coast, where rivers reached heights not seen before. In the Hawkesbury-Nepean, tens of thousands of homes experienced flooding, many for the first time in 3 decades. To put the flooding in perspective, at Penrith, this was a 1 in 35 year event, but for much of the rest of the Hawkesbury-Nepean, it was a 1 in 10 or 1 in 15 year event. And since 1800, Windsor has averaged 1 10-metre flood every 5 years, so the region has been lucky to have such a long gap between big floods. Looking at the history books, there have been other stretches with just the odd flood, but there have also been very active phases. There were 5 major floods between 1986 and 1992, and back in the late 1800s, there was a staggering spell of 11 floods in 16 years. What's concerning for the residents of Western Sydney is the link between these wet and dry spells and a little-known climate driver. In the Pacific Ocean, we watch out for El Nino events and La Nina events as they impact Australia for a year or 2 at a time. However, there is a longer-term pattern known as the Interdecadal Pacific Oscillation, or the IPO. That impacts Australia for multiple decades at a time, and we are currently in the first negative phase since the 80s. And data suggests negative phases are associated with increased flooding in the Hawkesbury-Nepean. In this graph, the dots represent the large floods at Windsor, whilst the line represents the IPO. You can see that most of the large floods are during periods when the line is below 0, whilst there are fewer floods when the line is above 0. In the last few years, we've moved into a more consistent negative phase of the IPO, meaning that the risk of large floods in the Hawkesbury-Nepean is now higher than normal. At Sky News Weather, we predict the next big flood is a greater than 50% chance to occur within the next 4 years. So if we remain in a negative IPO, then we are likely to see a total of 2 or 3 major floods between now and the end of the decade, one of which could easily be higher and more destructive than the recent March event.
Yeah, very fascinating. Well done on that, Rob. But in terms of the concern for Western Sydney and the impact as we're going to see down the track, how concerning is it?
Yeah, it's pretty worrying. I'd say for many people who've bought homes into that area, I'm sure that some people wouldn't realise how active a floodplain this is and how wide and deep the flooding gets in the Hawkesbury-Nepean. I mean, that's the Aboriginal name for that river system. Translates to wide and deep. So the flooding is not just a typical river. It floods a massive plain and can impact many people quite drastically. I mean, the March flood that we saw got up to 13 metres at Windsor, but the record flood is 18.6 metres at Windsor. So that's another 5.6 metres on top of water, and that happened back in the 1860s. So it's a region that I'd be very worried to own property in, for instance.
And for people that are perhaps asking the question about climate change and how it relates to this, is there any correlation at all?
Climate change, I think, will have some impact on how flooding occurs in this area, but I think it's going to be fairly minimal compared to just the way that this basin responds to the IPO, essentially. And I think climate change has less to teach us than history does in this area. So to me, the last 30 years are not something to base our experience on, but looking further back over the last 200 years has more to teach us about that river system than anything else.
All right, well, thank you for that. And just a quick look at today. We've got a front in the southwest of WA, so showers and storms. Are we looking at any warnings for places like Perth and surrounding areas?
I don't think we'll have any warnings today, but showers are going to be increasing, similar to what we had yesterday. We had a big band of rain roll through. Today it'll be a little bit more hit and miss with showers, but there'll be quite a few showers in the southwest, so it's looking pretty wet there. And looking ahead to the east of the country, and there'll be the odd shower around today as well. So maybe even Sydney, we could see a couple of showers today too.